I want you to think back to a workplace collaboration or maybe a group project that just suffered a complete and total system failure.
Oh, yeah. We've all been there.
Right, like the kind where those initial onboarding emails start off perfectly polite, complete with exclamation points and super optimistic timelines.
And then within a matter of days, the whole dynamic just completely collapses into CCing the manager, passive-aggressive updates, and, well, totally bruised egos.
Exactly. I mean, it is such a universal professional pain point. We usually walk away from those experiences thinking we were simply paired with an impossible person, rather than recognizing the structural failures that actually caused the collapse.
Yeah, the tendency is always to blame personality rather than process.
Yeah.
Like we assume a fundamental incompatibility. And that really blinds us to the actual mechanics of why the communication breaks down so rapidly.
That structural breakdown is basically the core of our deep dive today.
Right.
We're conducting a full autopsy on this really fascinating real-world case study in conflict resolution.
It's a great one.
It really is. So we have the actual verbatim email correspondence between two MBA students. Let's just call them Jane and John. And their partnership spectacularly imploded in less than a week.
Less than a week. Just completely fell apart.
Yeah, so our mission today is to decode the psychological and logistical missteps in their exchange, basically line by line. And we want to extract actionable frameworks you can use to bulletproof your own professional collaborations.
And the environment of this case study provides this perfect laboratory for this kind of analysis, because the stakes were high and the parameters were strictly controlled.
Right. This wasn't just a casual assignment.
No, not at all. This took place in a rigorous 7-week graduate-level strategic operations management course. I mean, these are adults in the final stages of an MBA program. So we are looking at the behavior of soon-to-be business leaders, not inexperienced freshmen.
They are ostensibly training to optimize really complex business workflows, right? Which makes the fact that they couldn't even manage a 2-person email thread deeply ironic.
It really highlights a huge blind spot in professional development. Because, look, the professor actually anticipated this friction.
Wait, really?
Yeah, like a week before the term started, students were randomly assigned into pairs alphabetically. And the structural rhythm of the class was super rigid. New assignments open on Monday, and they are due on Sunday.
Okay, so a very clear weekly sprint.
Exactly. And the professor posted this explicit announcement on their digital learning portal, this system called Moodle, and it explicitly instructed the students to treat their partnership as a shared learning system.
Meaning what, exactly?
Well, the instructions were to set regular meeting schedules, establish ground rules, agree on expectations, divide tasks clearly, and, share resources.
So the professor basically gave them a complete architectural blueprint for how to structure the partnership.
Yes, a literal step-by-step guide.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because despite having that explicit blueprint, the foundation cracks before the very first deadline.
It's obvious how fast it happens.
Let's examine the opening weekend of week 1. So it is Saturday afternoon, 3:01 p.m. Jane sends John an email stating she basically went ahead and submitted the entire assignment herself.
Just did the whole thing.
Yeah. She writes that she did this so they wouldn't risk missing the deadline. Now, she does acknowledge that people have different work schedules, but she notes her concern over his complete lack of communication, stating, she wasn't even sure if he was still planning to contribute.
And she closes that email by asking for a structural change. She writes, "For future assignments, I'd appreciate more communication so we can coordinate responsibilities and avoid last-minute uncertainty."
Which seems pretty fair. So then Sunday afternoon arrives, and John finally replies. He thanks her for submitting the work and mentions he did actually spend time on the assignment over the weekend and had intended to submit it himself.
Right.
But then he introduces this entirely new variable. He writes, "I think respecting each other's timelines is important," adding that as long as they communicate if there's a risk of missing the deadline, they should be totally fine.
What's fascinating here is that we are observing a massive fundamental mismatch in how two different professionals define the concept of a workflow.
Yeah.
Like you have two intelligent people looking at the exact same Sunday deadline, but they are operating under completely different definitions of what the word collaboration actually entails in a practical sense.
It really seems like they're operating under two totally different definitions of the word done.
Absolutely.
Like Jane's mental model treats collaboration as this multi-day process. In her mind, the Sunday deadline is just the final timestamp on a workflow that requires, early coordination, integration of different parts, and a buffer for peer review.
Right, she wants a runway.
Exactly. But John's mental model treats the official Sunday deadline as the only binding parameter. He views group work merely as completing his isolated half of the task right before the clock runs out on Sunday night.
And that is the crucial disconnect. John views a deadline as a target to hit. Jane views it as the end of a runway that requires a long approach. And for a course like Strategic Operations Management, well, the assignments inherently require integration.
Right. You can't just work in silos.
Exactly. Like if you are analyzing a complex supply chain, for example, you can't just staple two independent essays together at 11:59 p.m. and expect a cohesive argument. Jane recognizes this need for integration, and that's what drives her early action.
If we look at this systemically, it's kind of like planning a cross-country road trip. Jane is the project manager who builds out the itinerary, factors in traffic patterns, and, she wants the car fully packed and inspected by Friday night. That way the actual departure on Sunday morning is totally frictionless.
I love that analogy.
Yeah, but John is operating under a completely different logistical framework. He assumes that as long as he's physically sitting in the passenger seat right as the car is backing out of the driveway on Sunday morning, he has successfully fulfilled his obligation. The car hasn't left yet, so he genuinely doesn't understand why Jane is so stressed.
The irony is that John feels entirely compliant with the rules. Meanwhile, Jane has been internalizing all of the operational risk for basically 48 hours.
I do want to analyze Jane's decision to just do the work herself, though, because from a purely functional standpoint, she was fulfilling her fiduciary duty to her own grade, right?
Right.
If she has received zero communication from her partner by Saturday afternoon on a graduate-level project, well, calculating the risk of failure and neutralizing it by doing the work is a highly rational professional response.
It absolutely is.
Her initial email wasn't hostile at all. It was just a status update and a request for better communication.
Her risk assessment was entirely rational. The breakdown didn't occur because Jane did the work. The structural failure occurred because they both completely skipped the professor's directive to define their ground rules before the work started.
Oh.
They jumped straight into the task execution without building the operational infrastructure to support it.
And because they failed to align on that definition of done, Jane's lingering weekend anxiety inevitably mutates into a massive systemic breakdown by Monday morning. Like the logistical mismatch we just discussed turns into a severe relational conflict.
The escalation is just striking. Like the focus shifts entirely away from the coursework.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Monday morning, 6:23 a.m., Jane introduces an ultimatum. She emails John saying, "I cannot wait until Sunday to communicate about a time-intensive project that is also due Sunday. If this week is evidence of your participation, I expect to be partnerless for the rest of the term."
Wow. Yeah, so she has moved from requesting a process change to literally threatening to dissolve the partnership entirely.
Right. So John replies on Tuesday, defending his timeline. He writes, "Sunday was the due date, and we agreed I would do the second half by the due date. Don't really see the issue here." And then he introduces this highly toxic variable into the equation.
This part is wild.
He adds, "But whatever you feel is necessary to manage your timeline and sanity, I am good with."
Sanity. Just throwing that word in there?
Yeah. Jane ignores the comment about her sanity, demands to see the actual work he claimed he did over the weekend, and imposes a mandatory Friday deadline for all future work. She literally tells him to have the essay completed and available for review by Friday.
And John immediately rejects that newly imposed deadline. On Wednesday, he replies, "I'm slightly surprised you believe it's appropriate to treat a classmate as though they are expected to answer to your requirements. Your sense of entitlement doesn't create an obligation for me to follow your directives."
Jeez.
Yeah. He then states he will not submit his work for her approval, claims her previous email effectively fired him, and declares they will be working independently from now on.
And Jane's response?
Jane responds by simply saying she will accept his resignation.
In just a few days, they have completely abandoned the technical task. The strategic operations assignment is no longer even the subject of the emails. They are now exclusively managing a conflict of identity and perceived disrespect.
We are literally witnessing the pivot from task conflict to relationship conflict. Task conflict, like disagreeing on how to schedule the work, is actually healthy in a team. It drives optimization.
Right.
But text-based communication is incredibly poor at conveying nuance. Because email strips away paralinguistic cues like facial expressions, vocal tone, and body language, the brain often fills the void with the absolute worst possible interpretation of the sender's intent.
When John introduces the word sanity, he triggers a physiological response. For anyone listening who has ever felt their heart rate spike reading an email, that is a full amygdala hijack.
Exactly.
The analytical part of the brain that solves logistical problems just gets overridden by the ego defense mechanism. Once Jane's sanity is questioned and John's autonomy is challenged with terms like entitlement and directives, the problem is no longer about whether the draft is due Friday or Sunday. The problem is that the other person is a threat to their professional dignity.
Tone policing takes over entirely. Jane feels disrespected by his lack of proactive communication, viewing it as professional negligence. John feels disrespected by her unilateral decision-making, viewing it as a gross overstep of authority. I mean, he perceives her as treating him like a subordinate rather than a peer.
This complete collapse in psychological safety forces management, which in this case is Professor René Ordonez to finally intervene. Since Jane and John have effectively dissolved the partnership on their own, the professor has to manage the fallout.
Right, so on Thursday morning, Professor René sends an intervention email, and René frames the conflict as a failure to master an unwritten learning objective of the MBA program, which is cultivating the art of group dynamics. The professor notes that navigating different communication styles and timelines is basically an inevitable reality of executive life.
Setting that context is a solid managerial move. But the specific language René uses next is super fascinating. The professor writes, based on the tone and direction of the email exchange, it appears that neither of you is willing to work through the situation. Before I make that final determination, I would like to ask whether this can still be resolved. If not, I will grant both of your wishes to be ungrouped.
Right.
Keep in mind, if they are ungrouped, they face a massive penalty. They have to do a heavy two-person workload entirely alone for the rest of the term.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the most compelling part of this whole case study is Professor René's own postmortem analysis of this specific intervention.
Yeah, the reflection afterward.
When reflecting on the incident later, René realizes that the structural framing of this email actually hindered the students from reconciling.
It's so rare to see a leader dissect their own misstep like that. How exactly did the professor analyze the failure of that email?
Well, René identifies that the phrase, "before I make that final determination," fundamentally shifted the power dynamic in a really unhelpful way. It basically adopted the tone of a judge issuing a procedural ruling from the bench.
I see that.
Yeah, by positioning the administration as this ultimate arbiter who would grant their wishes to be ungrouped, the professor inadvertently removed the friction required for Jane and John to actually learn from the conflict.
By taking ownership of the final decision, René accidentally acted like an HR representative just sliding exit paperwork across the table, rather than, a coach calling a timeout and forcing the players to figure out a new play. Offering them the out of working individually gave them this easy escape hatch from the discomfort of mediation.
A core tenet of organizational behavior is that leaders should foster shared responsibility. So René realizes the intervention should have explicitly instructed the students to talk things through directly.
What would have been a better way to phrase it?
The revised, ideal wording the professor suggests in the self-critique is something like, "I would like to encourage the two of you to talk things through and make a sincere effort to resolve your disagreements in a positive and professional manner."
That slight shift in phrasing puts the operational burden right back on Jane and John. It forces them to mediate their own dispute rather than just retreating to their corners and waiting for the professor's gavel to drop. It's such a powerful reminder that when leaders step in to solve a relational conflict too quickly by offering procedural solutions, they often permanently finalize the conflict instead of resolving it.
Exactly. Providing a structural escape hatch basically validates the relationship conflict. What they actually needed was to be guided back to the negotiating table to solve the initial task conflict.
So let's explore that negotiating table. Let's look at the actual mechanics of the solution. If you find yourself in the middle of an escalating text-based conflict right now, how do you hit the brakes and arrest that momentum?
Well, the case study advocates for a highly structured reset conversation. The fundamental mechanism of this conversation is a deliberate pivot away from litigating the past, determining who is right or wrong, and focusing entirely on designing the future workflow. You have to move from identity back to process.
You literally have to stop defending your ego and start designing the architecture of how the work gets done.
Precisely. The reset conversation is where you take those implicit, unsaid assumptions and make them explicit.
What does that look like in practice?
The case study provides an idealized collaborative agreement for this specific asynchronous coursework. And the framework is simple but highly structured. First, touch base by Monday or Tuesday. Second, explicitly agree on the division of labor by Tuesday evening. Third, both partners post their draft sections by Friday evening. Fourth, Saturday is reserved strictly for integration, peer review, and edits. And finally, the project is submitted before the Sunday deadline.
That framework is honestly brilliant because it is so emotionally neutral, yet it structurally honors the psychological needs of both people. Like, Jane gets her visibility. By having drafts posted on Friday and a dedicated day for integration, her anxiety about quality control is completely neutralized.
Right.
But it also protects John's autonomy. He isn't subjected to daily micromanagement from Jane. He just has to hit a clearly defined internal milestone on Friday.
But, implementing a framework like that requires a complete overhaul of how they communicate. The source material provides these really targeted rewrites of the emails, demonstrating how to advocate for your workflow without triggering the other person's ego defense mechanism.
Let's analyze those rewrites. Because in the original exchange, Jane made these unilateral demands and threatened to dissolve the team. How should she have framed her need for a Friday deadline?
Instead of issuing a directive, the rewritten text positions her request as a process vulnerability. She should have written, "John, I realize we may have different expectations about timing. Because these assignments require review and integration, I am not comfortable waiting until Sunday to see your section. Could we agree that each of us will complete our portion by Friday evening so we both have time to review before submission?"
The mechanics of that phrasing are so effective. She doesn't attack his character or his work ethic at all. She just names the structural problem. These assignments require review, and then frames her boundary around her own comfort level. I am not comfortable waiting.
Exactly.
She then proposes the Friday deadline as a negotiated agreement, not some edict.
And John's rewritten response is equally critical to de-escalating the situation. Instead of accusing her of entitlement, he should have written, "Jane, I understand why you want time to review before the Sunday deadline. I had been working from the assumption that completing my portion by Sunday was acceptable, but I see that creates uncertainty for you. I can aim to have my part ready by Friday evening or let you know by Thursday if that will not be possible."
I had been working from the assumption. That might literally be the most valuable phrase in professional communication.
It really is.
It acknowledges the disconnect without assigning any blame. It just says, my mental model didn't match your mental model.
Yeah.
So what does this all mean for how we handle our own collaborations moving forward?
The underlying theoretical framework we are pulling from this case study is that effective collaboration requires way more than just technical competence. The technical execution is really only half the job.
And the other half?
The other half is the proactive negotiation of differing workflows. It requires explicitly checking assumptions and dividing labor in a way that respects autonomy. Like if you skip the step of building the operational infrastructure, the actual work will always collapse under the weight of those unset expectations.
To distill this down for you, the listener, there are 3 structural rules to pull from Jane and John's systemic failure. First, never assume your colleague shares your chronotype or your workflow. Just because a project is due at 5:00 p.m. on a Friday does not mean you both share the same definition of what the week leading up to it looks like. You have to clearly define what done actually means.
Absolutely essential.
Second, establish those ground rules when the environment is neutral, like before the stress of task execution actually begins. And third, monitor your own physiological responses. If an email chain starts triggering your ego defense mechanism, just stop typing. Text-based communication cannot resolve relational conflict. Step away from the keyboard and initiate a synchronous reset conversation.
Building on that concept of the reset conversation, there is a profound organizational insight buried right at the conclusion of this text. The case study highlights that this entire catastrophic breakdown, the accusations, the defensive posturing, the managerial intervention it could have been entirely avoided with a single 5-minute reset conversation the very moment the timeline mismatch was identified on Sunday.
It is staggering to consider the amount of time and emotional energy wasted over a 5-minute structural misalignment.
It really forces you to look at your own professional history through a totally new lens. I mean, think about the failed cross-departmental projects, the dissolved partnerships, or even the lingering resentments that create organizational drag today. How many of those failures weren't actually caused by a fundamental inability to work with another human being?
Right.
How many were simply the result of mismatched chronotypes and hidden workflows that calcified into personal attacks just because no one stopped to clarify their definition of done?
It reframes every frustrating group project you have ever been a part of. Avoiding a systemic breakdown doesn't require finding a partner with the exact same personality. It simply requires understanding the mechanics of communication, knowing when a logistical problem is masking itself as a personal attack, and having the discipline to reset the itinerary before the car pulls out of the driveway.